Antony, the officer and friend he trusted most, commanding the left. Both armies were drawn up in the traditional 3 lines, with the most experienced troops in the 3rd line. Pompey had 45,000 infantry to Caesar's 22,000. But his big advantage lay in his 7,000 cavalry, which outnumbered Caesar's 7-1. Caesar saw the threat from the enemy cavalry and removed a cohort from each legion to form a 4th line, which he placed behind his own cavalry as an extra line of defense. Pompey's troops made no attempt to advance, so Caesar ordered his legions forward. At that moment, Pompey's cavalry charged Caesar's cavalry, driving them back in disarray. The battlefield was covered in whirling dust. Archers and slingers ran in behind the cavalry and began to pelt Caesar's flank. The stones and arrows rained in. Caesar had been taken by surprise. The Battle of Pharsalus was on, and the winner would rule the Roman Empire. It is 49 BC. Rome's 2 greatest generals, Caesar and Pompey, fighting for supremacy. Caesar rallied his troops after the shock of the all-out cavalry charge. This was truly a civil war. Pompey's cavalry had been led by Caesar's old companion, Labienus. He had fought side by side with Caesar in Gaul, but had now gone over to Pompey.
Labienus' disloyalty was reflected in Caesar's own history of these events. Most nights, Caesar would dictate page after page to a scribe in his tent, or on the move as he traveled with his army. In Caesar's history of the war in Gaul, Labienus is a brave and loyal commander. But in the Civil War, he is portrayed as a savage and brutal opponent.
But having broken through Caesar's line, Labienus was in trouble. He could not reform his cavalry, and the left wing of Pompey's army, which had followed his charge, was milling around in confusion. Caesar sent in his 4th line against the horses. He ordered them to hold their pila upright and jab at horses and riders, like the spears in a phalanx.
Caesar told them to leap up, not to throw their spears, but to take their spears and push them up at the faces of these horsemen.
Ancient cavalry, indeed cavalry at most eras, don't do well against prepared heavy infantry. Pompeian cavalry were not expecting to run head-on into a well-disciplined line of Roman legionaries.
3,000 men, all with 8-foot spears, were just too much for the riders. Hundreds fell, and the remainder fled into the hills.
Caesar tells his men in the fighting line that even though they're outnumbered by the enemy legionaries, they can prevail because they're Caesar's men. And they do.
Caesar was an extraordinary leader of men. He had spent year after year after year with his troops in Gaul. He knew the names of his centurions. He lived with his men. He slept in the tents with his men, and his men were willing to fight and die for him.
Caesar now took control of the battle. He ordered his men to charge at the enemy. For 200 yards they ran. A hail of arrows rained down on helmets and shields. But even when they got to within 30 yards, Pompey's men still refused to advance.
He told his troops not to charge. The argument was that if you don't charge, Caesar's troops got to traverse twice the distance, and they're going to be tired out when they get here.
Caesar's centurions called a halt, gave their men a breather, and tidied up the ranks. But then they advanced through their pila. Pompey's army returned the volleys. Javelins flew from both armies at point-blank range. Both ranks collided, but they were evenly matched. Pompey's line held.
It was a battle like no other, with opponents asking one another to get news of their fate back to their families.
Caesar's fourth line could not make any headway against Pompey's weakened left wing. But then he ordered in his third line, which contained his most battle-hardened troops. Pompey's left wing broke completely, and standing in the center of his army, he saw his remaining legionaries turn and run. Pompey lost the will to fight and fled in panic back to his camp. Caesar had won the day.
What the civil war between them reveals is that Caesar is actually the better general, and that his success in Gaul had not been a flash in the pan. It was an instance of someone who has a tremendously flexible grasp of generalship and can inspire his men even more than Pompey did.
In his own written accounts, Caesar claimed he killed 15,000 of Pompey's men, lost only 200 dead, and captured 9 of the coveted eagles. But this was, after all, history written by the winner. The Greek historian, Plutarch, calculated Pompey's casualties at 6,000.
Pompey is described in most of the historical sources as being totally shattered by this and crazed almost by this defeat. He withdraws to his tent, he leaves his soldiers on the battlefield, he flees.
Pompey and his wife fled to the coast of Greece and sailed to Egypt. Caesar pursued, but the two rivals would never meet again. One of Pompey's own centurions murdered him as he stepped ashore near Alexandria. Caesar arrived 3 days later and was given Pompey's head in a sack, but he refused to look at it and ordered that Pompey be buried with full honors. He wanted to heal the wounds of civil war and showed mercy to many of Pompey's lieutenants, including Marcus Brutus, whose mother had been Caesar's lover.
Caesar wanted them to join him, and he sends tribunes in to tell the blokes, you know, you're Romans, we're Romans.
Caesar would stay for a while in Egypt and had a child by the young queen, Cleopatra.
The civil war was over. He now had supreme power in Rome. His victory marked the end of the old Roman Republic. After returning to Rome, he became dictator. He even had a month of the year named after him, Julius, July. From now on, the men who ruled Rome would be emperors with absolute power, claiming divine authority from the gods.
4 years later, in 44 BC, Caesar was stabbed to death by conspirators who feared he had amassed too much power. One of them was Marcus Brutus, whose life he had spared in Pharsalus. Bleeding from many wounds, Caesar fell dead at the feet of a statue, the statue of his greatest rival, Pompey the Great.